Okay. Um, the next session that we have is again just following our pattern over the past couple of days. Another sort of focus in session on a specific case that you know is embedded in this larger, broader question about the debates and disputes about the political role of the school across the political spectrum. So the session will focus on the case of censorship and administrative oversight. And our speaker from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro is Dr. Wayne Journell. And I'm going to turn it over to Wayne.
Thank you. So yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about censorship and how it relates to polarization, but then I am going to turn to, I don't want this to be all doom and gloom, right? Because we do have to deal with censorship, but I come from the vantage point of a social studies teacher. I'm a professor of social studies education at UNC Greensboro. And so, I come from this from a very practical standpoint of, but very practical standpoint of I've got to train my teachers to deal with this stuff, right? That teaching controversial issues and things in this climate of polarization and citizenship. So that's what I'm spend the vast majority of what I'm going to talk about today. But first, I'm going to tell you a story that actually happened last week. Okay, you may have heard that in the United States we have a pretty big election coming up. All right, maybe you've heard about that. So I got a call from someone from the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction last week, based on my research on controversial issues and teaching elections. And they said, we've been hearing from our teachers in North Carolina, the social studies teachers, and they're really worried about teaching this election. And they said, would you be willing to do a webinar for them? And I said, sure, why not? Okay. I actually have later this month, I'm going to be up at Bismarck, North Dakota. I've already been told, that they wanted me to teach the election and things like that. So I said, I've already got this thing ready to go. I said, no problem. And they said, well, would you mind meeting with us first and going over what you're planning on talking about? I said, that's odd. I've done stuff with the NC Department of Instruction before. They never asked, oversight stuff, but okay, sure. So I meet with them over Zoom and we have this conversation. They said, what were you thinking about teaching? So I said, I just basically went over what I was going to talk about in Bismarck, North Dakota. And it was a very nonpartisan, talking to students about how they can think politically about the election, talking about the electoral college, using polling data to kind of figure out what the swing states are, yada, yada, yada. There was nothing about like Trump was terrible, and nothing about that. Well, I got done with my spiel and there was just this awkward silence. And they said, yeah, we don't want you to say Trump or Harris's name. And I said, okay. And they said, we'd really prefer if you didn't say Democrat or Republican either. And I said, it's kind of hard to talk about an election without saying the candidate's name or the name of the parties. And I said, well, I guess I could do just a generic, how does the electoral college work? I said, but honestly, I would like to think that most social studies teachers know that already. And they were like, yeah. And I said, well, what did the teachers, when they said they wanted more resources about the election, what did they want from you all? And they said, they were really concerned about how to teach on November 6th, the day after the election. And I said, well, I don't know how to do that without saying the names of the candidates or so needless to say, the webinar is not happening. Okay. But I tell that story to kind of give you a sense of where we are, at least in the United States, with how serious polarization is and it's going into the schools. And as been talked about over the past couple days, we are much more politically polarized in the United States and from what I hear, Canada as well. And it's, this idea of the United States has always been a misnomer. We've never been a true United States. We've always been a country of regions. You can look at like electoral college maps from beginning of time all the way to present. And you see that, the Northeast votes one way, the West Coast votes one way, the middle of the country votes one way. Even as the parties have shifted over time and they look differently, we've still been a country of regions. And even more than that, we've really become a country of urban versus rural. And you see this again in the electoral maps and things like that. But one of the things that I thought Cam said in the Q&A here after his presentation is that, you know, in these multicultural societies, we tend to like even speak different, not physical languages, but talk about things differently and live different lives. The New York Times published several years ago a bunch of maps that told different stories about the United States. And one of them, and I don't know if you can see it in the back, but these are maps. This map in particular, I thought was really interesting. The number of people who watched the show Duck Dynasty versus the number of people who watched the show Modern Family, right? And I thought this was telling because even though we all live in the same country in the United States, we have this different hobbies. We watch different things. We find different things funny. We watch different sports. All of that plays a part into the fact that we're not just politically polarized. We're becoming much more socially polarized as well. And as no surprise, this polarization is permeating school walls, right? And what's happening here is we have three types of, and notice I use the word here, interrelated types of censorship. And I'm going to talk about each one of these briefly, but then I'm going to go again into how we can have teachers hopefully mitigate some of the issues with this. I don't know if this video, whoops, I had a video here and I don't think it's going to work because it's on it might. Sounds not, it's not a big deal if it doesn't work. That's okay. That's okay. So anyway, the video was from several years ago. It was a Fox News clip, and it was actually from the 2012 presidential election. And it was a teacher in North Carolina who got into a shouting match with her students. And basically, she had written a fact on the board that at the time Mitt Romney had admitted that he had bullied a student back when he was a high school student or something. And the teacher taught in a fairly conservative district in North Carolina, and a student challenged her and said, "Are you saying that Barack Obama didn't, bully anybody in school?" And of course, in the day and age that we live in, this was all recorded on YouTube, and it went viral, right? And if we could watch the clip, the Fox News anchors are just giddy that it went viral, and the fact that this teacher's, yelling at her students, and the teacher ended up getting first suspended, then fired. And I think maybe down the line she got her job back. But honestly, she probably should have been disciplined and probably should have been fired because not of what she was talking about, but how she was doing it. Right. We, when we talk about how we engage with controversial issues, we want to be the model for our students as far as, being able to talk about these things in tolerant ways. Getting in a shouting match with your students, probably not the best way to go about doing it. And so, when I deal with my pre-service teachers and we start talking about teaching controversial issues and things, many of them don't even mention like the other types of censorship that I'm going to talk about here in just a second. But they've come out and say, I can't do it. Right. Because they're afraid of parents, they're afraid of the administrators, they're afraid of, everything else. But mainly they're afraid of the teacher going viral. So they self-censor themselves. They don't want to be that teacher that ends up on social media or on Fox News. And I get that, right? We all get that. But at the same time, I try to tell them that most of the time, the teachers who end up on, cable news or social media, it's not because they were teaching controversial issues or teaching about politics. It's how they were doing it, right? And the analogy that I always like to use is if you do a Google search of teachers who've been fired for classroom management, things, right? You can find all sorts of teachers who've done dumb types of things with classroom management. And I've got some on the screen here. Just came up with a Google search. Nobody's calling for the stoppage of all classroom management, right? But yet, when we talk about teaching controversial issues and politics, that tends to be the knee-jerk reaction, right? So that leads to the next type of censorship that I was going to talk about today, administrative censorship. Okay. As social studies teachers, we understand the value of civic disagreement, right? And a lot of the presenters the past couple of days have talked about the importance of civic disagreement, as well as the importance of building consensus, right? Unfortunately, too many administrators don't understand that. They're not former social studies teachers. They haven't been trained in those types of things, which is why one of the things that I've been working on in my own research is trying to build the bridge between, social studies teachers and administrators, right? Because administrators, they hold the key to a lot of these things. And a lot of times whenever there's a complaint, the administrators take the knee-jerk reaction of, let's not talk about anything controversial, right? Which kind of goes, it kind of, um, undercuts the democratic purpose of education. It's the path of least resistance. But if you're an administrator, you kind of understand that, right? Because you want to, avoid, concerns from parents and students and other things, right? Um, and then, to the administrator's credit, they're also dealing with legislative censorship. And we're seeing this tons in the United States. And I don't know, Canada, I don't know if it's quite as bad here, but in the United States, states are passing all sorts of divisive concepts, laws, anti-CRT measures, Florida, the Don't Say Gay bills that were passed there. And you're seeing all sorts of these types of censorships. And they do have real life consequences. All right, teachers have been fired. This is Matthew Hahn. Matthew Hahn was a teacher in Tennessee, and if you want to Google his case, it's Matthew Hahn versus Sullivan County, Tennessee. Notice the title of the article says 4 witnesses testify at fired Sullivan County teachers hearing. I was one of those four witnesses. For the better part of 2 years, I've served as an expert witness on behalf of Mr. Hahn as he's tried to get his job back. And Mr. Hahn was fired for primarily by saying white privilege was real. Okay, and it was a very conservative Tennessee district, and they said that, and of course, their argument would be that they told him to stop and he didn't stop and they fired him. But basically, it boiled down to that white privilege was real. And so back in August, he got dismissed by the school board. And then under Tennessee law, since he was a tenured teacher, he got to appeal it to a chancery court. And so I and a professor at Vanderbilt University were 2 of the expert witnesses that came in and testified. And I know we have some doctoral students here, so I'll tell you, getting cross-examined by a lawyer, way worse than defending your dissertation. So you don't have to worry about that. But yeah, it was an interesting experience, and we still don't know the result of the case. It's probably going to be decided at the end of October, early November. But for the better part of 3 or 4 years, he's been fighting to get his job back. So these are very real consequences to these types of laws that we're seeing in the United States. All right, now, where I really want to talk about, though, is what can teachers do? Okay, I mean, teachers have to live in this reality of censorship, and I know we've got practicing teachers in here. That's why I wanted to talk about this from a kind of a practitioner standpoint. One thing that they can do is just say, "I give up. I'm not teaching about any of this stuff that's controversial at all." But I reject that premise. I'm a social studies educator, and I think it's important that we engage in controversy and engage with the political in order to teach for democracy. Because as Cam was saying, I go back to Dewey, that classrooms are laboratories of democracy. If they're not talking about it in classrooms, where are they going to be talking about these things? That said, this current climate requires that teachers be thoughtful about how they do these things. Okay, because not just for the consequences, but because we are in a polarized society where students are coming in, having heard things from their families, having heard things, from their places of worship, and they're coming into schools. And schools are important because not just because of the laboratory of democracy, but I go back to what Walter Parker has written, that even in the most homogeneous of neighborhoods and societies, schools give you more heterogeneous opinions than you find with your circle of friends, at your family dinner table, or at your places of worship. So it's important that we have these conversations. Okay, so my job as a social studies educator, as I prepare pre-service teachers, is to prepare them to be able to do this in a thoughtful way. And in my experience, what I have found where teachers get in the most trouble when they deal with issues related to censorship and getting in trouble with administrators is when they teach issues that are open as settled or issues that are settled as open. Okay. And so that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk here. And so um, this idea of open and settled issues, I'm certainly not the first person to come up with this. Okay. But what I've done in my recent research over the past several years is try to come up with ways that teachers can think thoughtfully about this. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, an open issue is an issue in which there are multiple valid positions. Okay, and open issues should be presented in a balanced way that acknowledges all valid sides of the issue. Okay, and we'll go over some examples here in a minute. Settled issues, on the other hand, are issues in which there's only one valid opinion. All right, then settled issues should be presented as having that one valid opinion, and the non-valid opinion should not be legitimized within the classroom space. Okay, so that's the basic definitions that we're working on here. All right. Now, a couple things to remember. How we determine open versus settled is not what I as the educator believes or what you as the educator believes. Okay, we're all political beings. That's, I always tell my students there's no such thing as a neutral classroom. All right, it just doesn't exist because we're all political beings. And like so, I'm anti-gun, right? With all the school shootings that we've had in the United States. I don't know if any of you watched the vice presidential debate a few days ago, and the Democratic vice presidential candidate Tim Walz said, maybe sometimes it's just the guns. That's where I'm coming from on this. That said, I realize there's a Second Amendment in the United States, right? So I could not go into my classroom and just come out and say that the Second Amendment is a settled position and go that way. We have to teach that as an open issue. Also, this is probably even more important. Not everyone has to agree on something for it to be a settled issue. I always tell my students that if you teach in the US South long enough, and I've personally witnessed it, you will run into a student that says, slavery wasn't that bad, right? That's not the time to go, that's interesting. Let's teach the controversy. No, right? Slavery was bad, right? And as a teacher, you have that ability, the power to say, no, we're not going to entertain that opinion on this particular topic. Now, open and settled issues can shift over time. Okay, Diana Hess has called this tipping. All right, so at one point in U.S. history, it was a very much an open issue of whether, say, women could have the right to vote. Right, that is a settled issue now. Probably the best example is the one that Diana Hess gives, that during World War II, when the U.S. Incarcerated Japanese Americans, at that time, it was a settled issue that the United States could and should have done that. Right? There was even a Supreme Court decision, Korematsu versus the United States, that reinforced that Roosevelt had the right to do it, and it was a time of war, and he probably should have. Well, as we finished the war and started going across past time, people started going, yeah, that might have been kind of a crappy thing to do. All right. And so the issue went from settled and started to tip to the point in the 1970s. There was a formal apology by the United States that said we shouldn't have done this, to the point by, I think, the late 1980s, the United States actually paid reparations to people who were still living who were incarcerated during World War II, to the point now in 2024, it is a settled issue on the other side that it was a crappy thing to do. It was a human rights violation. All right. So this idea of tipping from open and settled is important. Now, you might be saying, well, how do we determine whether something's open or settled? Right? And if you're sitting here waiting for me to tell you exactly how to do it, I'm sorry, you're going to be disappointed, right? Because I wish there was one like clear formula. It just doesn't work that way. So I'm going to talk about, there's actually in the literature, there's 4 criteria that have been established as far as determining the openness of issues. I'm going to talk about the one that no one likes anymore. Okay, the first one that kind of came out was the behavioral criterion. And basically the behavioral criterion said that issues should be taught as open if anybody, disagrees on a particular issue. All right. Well, by and large, scholars have said we're not going to buy into that one for a couple reasons. First, there's not enough time in the curriculum to debate every possible issue that anybody might have an opinion on, right? We have to draw the line at some point. And also, as Noah mentioned in his talk yesterday, no matter what kind of issue you're talking about, you're going to find somebody that's still going to believe in, the opposite of even the most settled issues. Then, as Noah said, there are people out there who believe that the Earth is flat. And again, I don't think that in the science class we should be teaching the controversy of whether the Earth is flat or round. So, as by and large, we're going to dismiss the behavioral criterion. So, absent that, we have within the literature established 3 criteria for determining the openness of issues. And I'm going to talk about these in order, but I don't mean to talk about these in a way that means that one is better than the other. Okay. All of these are legitimate ways of thinking about whether issues are open or settled. The first one the literature defines as the epistemic criterion. And basically, it's that openness is determined solely based on available data or facts. It does not take into account personal beliefs that cannot be empirically verified, like religious beliefs, right? So, from the epistemic criterion, if someone, disagreed with something because of a moral reason or a religious reason, they would say, tough, right? Tell me the data, the cold hard facts over something. The next one is what the literature calls the political criterion. And this one to me is the hardest one to describe, but I kind of describe it as the live and let live criterion. And it kind of goes back to Cam mentioned this in his talk about John Rawls and Amy Gutman, and the idea that when there are competing versions of the good life, schools should not repress people's private values unless there has been clear consensus within society, right? So that's where the slavery example comes in. Society has determined that slavery is not good, right? So we would not consider opinions contrary to that and give them legitimacy. Most recently, social studies scholars Diana Hess and Paula McAvoy, who I'm big fans of, they have argued that like the epistemic criterion in particular is too narrow. And so they said that we should frame issues as open if they could be taught, if they have traction in the public sphere, if they're being discussed in the halls of Congress or Parliament or whatever the case may be at your local school board level, whatever it is. Okay. And they called that the politically authentic criterion. Now, in a perfect world, issues would be open or settled on all 3 of them, and we could just call it a day, right? The problem is, a lot of times that happens, sometimes it doesn't. So I'm going to actually go through 5 test cases to kind of show you the difficulty and the sometimes subjective opinions that teachers have to make in order to, justify their pedagogy. All right. So I'm going to start with what I think is an easy one. Is illegal immigration into the United States a problem that needs to be solved? Okay. So if we look at this from all 3 perspectives, okay, the epistemic criterion would say it's open because, yes, people are breaking the law when they enter the United States illegally, and some, individuals do commit crimes, right? That said, all the data out there to suggest that all immigrants, both legal and undocumented, are less likely to commit crimes than native born Americans, right? They tend to be very productive members of society. The political criterion would also frame it as open, okay? Because we're talking about fundamental rights here. And it becomes a question of which fundamental rights are we prioritizing in this debate, such as the right of people fleeing, horrible conditions in their home countries to come hopefully get a better life, or the fleeing or the fears of native-born Americans fearful of crime or having jobs taken, keeping in mind that the data doesn't necessarily support that those fears, but that yet the fears persist, right? And so again, that's an example between the difference between the epistemic criterion and the political criterion. And then, of course, the politically authentic criterion should be the easiest one of all, we've been debating immigration in the United States since the beginning of time. It's just we've changed who we've been, whether it's the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1920s, or the Irish in the late 1800s, or the surge of immigrants from Mexico and Latin America now. And it is one of the biggest issues in the current 2024 debate, presidential election. Sorry. So this is the good news is most issues are going to be like this one, where it's open across the board, right? And so teachers can kind of look at this and say, okay, we're going to teach this from an open perspective. We're going to look at pro and con, and hopefully students will determine their own feelings about immigration based on the available evidence, right? That said, just because an issue is clearly open, you have to be careful about how you discuss it in class, right? You might be teaching a class where you have undocumented students in the class, that you're talking to, right? Knowing that should reframe how you are discussing this in tolerant ways. That said, it still should be framed as an open issue in these classes from a civic standpoint. That makes sense? Okay. All right, that was the easy one. We're going to go harder. Okay. All right. Now, Noah already talked about this one. Okay. Is global warming due to human activity a real thing? Now, Noah in his talk yesterday, and I agree with Noah on this, he went from an epistemic perspective, right? That the overwhelming number of scientists agree that the Earth's climate is warming due in part to human activities, right? So from the epistemic perspective, it's a settled issue. So in science class, you would say, no, we're not entertaining, opinions contrary to this. Now, the political criterion would say that some people might say that there is a religious aspect. Jennifer Halver's done studies to show that very religious pre-service social studies teachers don't buy into global warming because they think that it's part of divine intervention and things like that. So the political criterion would say, they can treat that as an open issue. And then, of course, it's an open issue in the United States, sadly. As you can probably tell from my comment, I agree with no and how we should treat it. But we have, politicians, including the person running for president, who's called global warming a hoax. So from the politically authentic criterion, it could be considered open. So the question then becomes, when you've got a split here, what should teachers do? Okay. The quick answer is there is no right answer to this. Remember, all three of the criteria are equally valid. Okay. Now, again, my personal belief is similar to Noah's. I would teach it as a settled issue. Okay. So in this aspect, I would go with the epistemic criterion. That said, I think context also plays a part here. If I was teaching in a science class, I definitely would teach it as a settled issue. If I was teaching a civics class, I probably would still teach it as a settled issue, but I could see the argument of teaching it from an open issue because of the discussion in the halls of Congress and things like that. The point is, teachers could justify their pedagogy based on how they saw this, and it does involve a little bit of subjective opinions on the teachers and how they view it, right? All right. Third one, should interracial marriage be legal in the United States? Okay. And if you're not familiar with the US context, interracial marriage was ruled legal by the Supreme Court in 1967, although people still disagree with it. Okay. So again, remember, with a settled issue, not everybody has to agree. All right. So the epistemic criterion. No research out there suggests that interracial couples pose a detriment to society, adversely affect same-race couples' marriages, or that interracial couples are worse parents than same-race couples. So it's a settled issue from the epistemic criterion. Political criterion. In the Loving versus Virginia case that determined that interracial marriage was legal, they framed marriage as a basic civil right of man. Okay. Therefore, contrary private views would infringe on public rights. And then the politically authentic criterion. In the United States system, the only way to overrule a Supreme Court decision is with a constitutional amendment. And without getting too much into my civics teacher weeds here, that ain't happening. right? To pass a constitutional amendment on anything in the U.S. context, you have to get 3/4 of state legislatures and 2/3 of Congress. You couldn't get 3/4 of state legislatures and 2/3 of Congress to agree that the sky is blue in the United States at this point, okay? Or a reversal of that decision by the Supreme Court. And neither one of those is happening. So you have to go back to Hess and McAvoy's definition of traction within the public sphere. Even though there are people who disagree with this, there's no traction. So it would be settled. Now, this hopefully doesn't surprise you, right? I mean, we have interracial couples in the United States. You know, I mean, if you look at the trend numbers, trends of interracial couples getting married is skyrocketing. Okay, I give this example because I give this example to my students too, and we go through this, and they're like, "Oh, it's definitely a settled issue, definitely a settled issue, definitely a settled issue," and then I trick them, and I give them this one. Okay, and should same-sex marriage be legal in the United States? Well, here's the thing: all I'm going to do here is change interracial with same sex. It's the exact same argument. Okay. All right. So again, if you don't know the U.S. context, it was ruled legal in 2015, the Oberfeld v. Hodges decision, but obviously disagreement still exists. So from the epistemic criterion, no research to suggest that same-sex couples pose a detriment to society, adversely affect opposite-sex couples' marriages, or that same-sex couples are worse parent than opposite-sex couples. So from an epistemic criterion, settled issue. Okay. And in fact, there's been a lot written in educational philosophy about this. Michael Hand has written about this. From the political criterion, they actually use the same wording from the Loving decision in the Oberfeld decision. All right. So it's a fundamental right. Contrary private views would infringe on public rights. Settled. Now, this last one's where it's a little bit ambiguous. I actually wrote an article back in 2018 where I made the case that we should be teaching same-sex marriage as a settled issue post Obergefell. And I went through this exact same thing in the article, and I said that epistemic criterion settled, political criterion settled, and the politically authentic criterion I said was settled, right? Because at that time there was no traction there. The Supreme Court very rarely, if ever, rescinds rights that they've given to citizens. That said, all right, I'm not sure my 2018 article holds up, because if you paid attention to U.S. politics, the Dobbs decision actually reversed Roe v. Wade, which rescinded rights from women. And if you read Justice Thomas's concurring opinion on there, he said other cases, and he included the Oberfeld decision, are potentially up for rethinking. Okay. And given the current composition of the court, I don't know. I wish I could tell you on this one. This one involves some subjectivity. I still don't think it's going to, I would still teach it as settled, because I think the chances of them reversing that Supreme Court decision are not likely, but I can't say it's zero at this point. Back in 2018, I said it was zero. This time it's not. So the reason why we go over these types of epistemic, these different ways of thinking about controversial issues is, it's hopefully takes a little bit of the subjectivity out of this, because we want to, we don't want to treat issues because they simply feel controversial. Because, this, and especially prior to Dobbs, I would go over this exact same scenario with my pre-service teachers. And when I'd go over the interracial marriage, they'd be all settled, settled, settled. No, everybody was agreed to settle. I put up the same-sex marriage using the exact same rationale, and they'd go, "Ooh, I don't know if we can teach that as settled." And I would say, "Why?" Well, I don't know. Everybody's just all worked up about it, right? Well, not everybody's all worked up about it. If you look at the statistics, most recent ones I could find, 22% of Americans oppose same-sex marriage, and 19% of Americans oppose interracial marriage. And I would imagine if you did like a Venn diagram of those, it'd be pretty much a circle, right? So, just because something has happened recently doesn't mean we shouldn't treat it as open or settled just because it happened recently as opposed to 70 years ago, right? So, when we talk about this, and it goes back to this idea of censorship and things like that, we want to make sure that when we're training teachers, we want to think, not have knee-jerk reactions based on, fear, but instead you frame things based on, thoughtful decisions. And so the amount of time an issue is tipped becoming settled should not matter in that decision. All right. Last one. Oh, sorry. So I did want to say something else before I get to the last one. For the sake of argument, I would still teach same-sex marriage as settled. But let's say for the sake of argument, you decide that same-sex marriage is open using the politically authentic criterion, and you want to teach it as open. Okay. Um, you then kind of relate it to how we talked about global warming. There's no right answer to that. But I've written in the past about not all issues are created the same. Okay. It's one thing to have a discussion about whether we should have presidential elections determined by the popular vote or the electoral college in the United States. I mean, you can have good arguments on both sides of those type of things. But when you deal with what I've called in my writing controversial identity issues, you need to be careful. Okay. Because again, you might have LGBTQ students sitting in front of you and then having an open debate about whether they should be able to allowed to have the right to get married. That could be potentially traumatic, could be potentially harmful. And so when those cases split, when the epistemic criterion says something settled and the other ones say that it's open and you're dealing with a controversial identity issue, I tend to argue that we should teach it from the epistemic standpoint and teach it as settled. But I'm not saying I'm right on that. But I've written about that. That's the way I would go with it. All right, let's do one for fun here at the end. Okay. Was the 2020 presidential election stolen? All right. Epistemic criterion. All right. I know maybe not all of you are as well versed what's going on in the US as I am, but Trump took it to court like 60 times. He was 0 for 60. All the challenges. He kept saying he had evidence. No evidence ever. He's full of it. Right there from the epistemic criterion. There's no reason to suggest that the 2020 election was stolen. The political criterion. One of the fundamental things that has been hallmark of the U.S. political system is our peaceful transfer of power. And of course, on January 6th and stuff, that was challenged. But yet we still inaugurated Joe Biden, settled issue. Now, of course, the politically authentic criterion, there's a large section of the U.S. public that believes that the election was stolen. And of course, President Trump still claims that it's stolen. So how would we teach this? You could teach it as open, but then this gets back to Maya's talk yesterday. How much conspiracy theories do we want to give credence to in the classroom when we talk about something like this? Because, to talk about that the 2020 election was stolen would involve people believing things that simply aren't true. Based on what they've heard on social media and things like that. So again, I'm not saying I'm right on this one, but I would definitely teach the 2020 election as a settled issue, that there was no corruption, there was no things like that. So, so again, the purpose of going through those test cases was to kind of give an idea of how teachers can thoughtfully navigate this climate of censorship and polarization, because it's not easy. The easy way to go about this is to say I'm just not doing it, right? But again, as a social studies educator, that can't be the path forward. We have to continue talking about these issues for the reasons the other presenters have talked about throughout the past couple of days. And in order to do that, we have to equip our teachers with an understanding of how we do this in thoughtful ways. And again, I don't want to say that I'm right on every single one of these, or every teacher is going to be right in how they frame it, but at least if they can justify their pedagogy through clear framing that's been established in the literature, they can at least, if a parent, because Lord knows a parent's going to complain, an administrator is going to complain, a student's going to complain. That's part and parcel with teaching social studies. Hope there's no math teachers in here, because when my student teachers always get shy about teaching controversial issues, and I say, well, if you don't want to deal with controversy, you can go to the math methods course, because no one gets worked up about 2 + 2 is 4, right? I know, but my social studies students get a kick out of that. But I knew that I might get some groans from the math folks in here. But in all seriousness, though, within social studies education in particular, and I would say science and language arts also deal with this, we have to deal with um, issues related to censorship and being able to think about these in thoughtful ways. So this is just a way that I wanted to go over ways that I go with talk about this with my pre-service teachers, and hopefully found it useful. So thank you.
Thank you, Wayne. And I'm going to introduce Bruce Maxwell, who's going to respond. Bruce is a professor of education law at the University of Montreal, just across the way. Bruce.
I have to start by moving this computer, or maybe I'll just put my computer on top of the other one. No, that's not a good idea. Yeah. So, yeah, my position's in education law, but also professional ethics and teaching. And I think you'll see both aspects of my areas of work in this hopefully short response. I'm actually the ideal person to be doing this response because I am literally the president of the Wayne Journell fan club. Okay. I mean, his work, his elegant and important work on how teachers deal with American, the research program that I know was during the 2016 presidential election, and he did this fascinating study of how teachers deal with it, and also how students perceive teachers dealing with this controversy. And he's also written some very insightful work on teacher impartiality, which is one of my current interests. So in this short reply, I'm going to focus on 2 points. I'm going to focus on the issue of administrative censorship, and also on the issue of the definitional criteria of controversial issue, a controversial issue. And I think listening to Wayne's talk, I think it's clear we agree on almost everything, except I think the language that should be used to talk about deciding about which issue should be considered controversial and not. And even I would question that way of framing the problem, but we'll get to that. Maybe quick anecdote of my own. Okay, I've been doing, based on Dave Waddington and Kevin McDonough's work and my work on teacher free speech, tons of professional development work in the Montreal area over the last few years. There's always the inevitable Zoom, discussion beforehand, and one time out of two, okay, the administrators say, well, you can say that, but don't say that. And you can say that. So my talks on teacher free speech, okay, have basically half the time are censored. Okay. Okay. So the administrative censorship point. What I want to talk about is this common justification that was it was in a tiny little. This quote came out is really really tiny in the slide, but it was. I'm going to read the quote out. At least one California principal has told his teachers to avoid talking about politics, elections, and current events. And this is what the principal says. Unfortunately, my parents cannot handle it. So I indicated that it's not appropriate for them to teach these subjects in class. This is not me or my administrative team being afraid of conflict. We're taking rather a pragmatic approach so that our school can function with as little disruption as possible and hopefully without violence. But this is a common claim you hear from school administrators. And in my reading, this claim to be able to legitimately prevent teachers from discussing certain topics, the principal is invoking professional responsibility and a legal right, both of which I think have some validity. The professional responsibility is to maintain a safe school and an orderly environment favorable to learning. It follows from this responsibility that if teachers act or propose to act in ways that disrupt the normal operation of the school or that lead to compromised student safety, then the principal has a duty to act to prevent teachers from acting that way, right? The legal right invoked is the right to management. So the right to management implies, of course, that if a principal has issued a legitimate managerial directive to teachers in the school not to act a certain way, on the grounds, for example, that acting that way disrupts normal operation of the school or leads to compromised student safety, then teachers are required to comply. And I take it that neither the responsibility to maintain order and ensure student safety or the right to management in some broad sense or controversial in any way at all. But what is controversial and therefore somewhat more interesting are the following two questions. One, can principals curtail teachers' right to free speech in a classroom based on the right to management? And second, is it reasonable to believe that discussing politics, elections, and current events in class will lead to a disruption in the normal operation of the school or compromise safety? Now, with regard to the first question, I think the answer is a qualified yes. So principals can curtail teacher free speech in some circumstances. In fact, as our work on the jurisprudence on teacher free speech revealed, teachers, like students, don't leave their constitutional rights at the schoolhouse gate. However, the exercise of those rights can be justifiably limited by school officials in certain circumstances. And one of those circumstances, indeed, is when teacher speech leads to material and substantive disruption to the school environment. But what our research also showed is that in the US, the jurisprudence has taken a dramatic turn in favor of school officials' right to manage in recent years with respect to the control of free speech. In 2007, in particular, the Seventh Circuit Court applied the 2006 Garcetti ruling of the US Supreme Court to a teacher free speech case. This was the Meyer versus Monroe County Community School Corp ruling. Garcetti asserted that the expression of civil servants in the course of their duty was not protected by the constitutional right to free speech, but could be considered rather hired speech subject to their right to management. So following the same reasoning, 1 year later, the Seventh Circuit Court, deferring to the Garcetti ruling while ignoring explicit reservations expressed in this by the U.S. Supreme Court in this decision about the applicability of Garcetti to teacher speech. So when primary school teacher Deborah Meyer faced disciplinary action at work for expressing her opposition to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, citing, in fact, she said, among other things, that she thought it was, she's talking to children. She said, well, I'm against it because I think that, adults like children can find peaceful solutions to the conflicts, right? That was what she said. It's a really nice message, but her contract wasn't renewed. And the Seventh Circuit Court upheld the decision of the manager to impose this punitive action against her. So I would say that unfortunately, principals in the U.S. right now are very close to having unfettered managerial rights when it comes to issuing directives like the one issued by this California principal to teachers about what they can say in class, regardless of potentially overriding educational concerns that may be in play. In particular, how important discussing politically sensitive issues might be as a form of civic education, right? And I would, hazard to guess that the principal may be aware of this. May be aware of this development. So the second, be that as it may, the next question is it reasonable to believe that discussing politics, elections, and current events in class will lead to a disruption in the normal operation of the school or compromise safety? And again, if it does, like the answer to that question is yes, then the position of the principal would seem to have some merit. The answer to this question turns, of course, on what is meant by disruption in the normal operation of the school or compromise safety. And as it happens since the late 1960s, the approach that the U.S. Courts in the U.S. and Canada have taken to assessing allegations of just this kind, again, it's quite a common claim on the part of school officials, is to apply the material and substantive disruption standard associated with the 1969 U.S. Supreme Court ruling in Tinker. So what does Tinker have to say about this? Well, what it says is that it's legitimate for school officials to restrict speech or expression that material and substantially interferes with the requirements of appropriate discipline in the operation of this school, or might reasonably have led school authorities to forecast substantial disruption or material interference with school activities. Okay. So as it's being used in the courts anyway, the standard is fairly high. It was successfully used to defend school officials' decision to prevent a student from wearing a jacket adorned with a Confederate flag because they anticipated that doing so would lead to a riot in the school. This is the 1967 Melton decision of the Sixth Circuit Court. However, the following student actions failed the reasonable substantive disruption test. Wearing freedom buttons to protest voting discrimination, wearing armbands to protest against a war. Somebody who recognized Tinker in that. Much more recently, posting a video critical of teachers on social media. And finally, using vulgar language to criticize school staff on social media again. So as these cases suggest, whatever the exact nature of the standard might be, it certainly does not permit school officials to curtail teacher free speech in order to ensure as little disruption as possible, right? The standard is much, much higher than that. All of the events at the center of these cases caused disruption in the school environment, of course. If they didn't, clearly, they wouldn't have led to litigation. And yet the courts did not uphold school officials' rights to censor these expressive activities. Having said that, is it ever reasonably foreseeable for a teacher's choice to address a politically sensitive issue in class that will lead to a disruption in the normal operation of the school or compromise student safety? Of course it is. Of course it is. And here are two not so hypothetical examples, in fact, drawn from media reports that seem to instantiate these kinds of cases. One, the Quebec people in the audience here from Quebec might recognize this one, having students watch a video of a real murder as a means to introduce the theme of how exposure to violence affects young people. Okay. Another one is using the events of a recent murder of one member of a racialized community by another member of another racialized community as a teachable moment in class in which members of both communities are present in the class. So having like a debate about, what's going on between these two communities. In such cases, okay, school officials would, it seems, be completely justified, in my view, in issuing a directive to the teacher to address, not address the topic, and even imposing sanctions on a teacher who showed such poor pedagogical judgment. And as much as Wayne said and expressed in his talk, as much as one can sympathize with school officials who have to deal with parental and student complaints, a measure of discord resulting from teachers from teaching and talking about politically sensitive issues should not be seen as disrupting the normal school of the environment, but rather part of its normal operation. In other words, this disruption should be seen as a feature, right, rather than a bug, as they say. I've got a little bit more to say. How am I doing for time? Yeah. Okay, not sure I can do that, but I'll try. Okay. 2 minutes. Okay. Okay, I'll just kind of I think I can do that. Yeah, okay. So in conclusion, I want to take issue with the sort of second part of Wayne's talk, namely the use of these well-established criteria from the philosophy of education literature as a way for teachers, as a heuristic, in fact, for teachers to think through whether to talk about controversial issues, or I should say politically sensitive issues, impartially or impartiality. I think it's time for us to move beyond this approach for two reasons. One, each of the four standard heuristics has, in my view, significant limitations as such a heuristic, which I think are underestimated in your talk. And second, there's a better way. Now, I'm not going to be able to go into my specific critiques of all four of these criteria, and we do have a different interpretation, especially the political criteria, and I agree with you that it's harder to get your head around that one. But I think they all have problems, and even, well, they all have problems, and you can read about what I think about those problems if you like. There's a chapter in the Cambridge Handbook of Democratic Education in which I talk about this, and there's a more detailed article coming out in Ed Theory on the matter. But what's the better way? Okay, what's the better way? Assuming that these four criteria don't work. In my view, what we need to do is just start treating teaching and talking about sensitive issues like any other problem in professional ethics and teaching. Okay, that's to say, identify the professional obligations at stake, and in the case of a conflict between professional obligations, figure out how to strike a reasonable balance between them in the circumstances. Okay. So my research on the content of codes of conduct for teachers has shown that there's a widespread expectation expressed in codes of ethics, and the teachers here can confirm this, and I suspect that they will, that teachers need to adopt a stance of impartiality whenever they deal with politically sensitive issues. Like, that's the sort of baseline, right? This is referred to often as the duty of impartiality in teaching. And it's expressed in multiple codes of ethics in Canada, in the US, in other countries. Now, that doesn't mean teachers always have to be impartial when they're teaching about politically sensitive issues. The question of whether a teacher is justified in teaching and talking partially about politically sensitive issues comes down to the question of in which circumstances is it professionally justified to make an exception to the duty of impartiality. Okay. And as in the case with all professional obligations, the right way to approach this problem is to think about other compelling professional obligations in play and consider whether they should be overriding. So, for example, teachers have a duty to keep private information about their students confidential. This is the duty of secrecy, unless sharing private information is in the student's best interest. And this is often in the case of the obligation to report suspected cases of abuse and neglect. So in the case of the duty of impartiality, it seems to me that there are at least two and maybe more potentially overriding professional obligations. One, Wayne referred to this as sort of in passing in his talk, the duty to teach subject matter in accordance with disciplinary expertise. And second, the duty to maintain a respectful and inclusive classroom environment. And again, I take that both of these duties are familiar and neither of them are controversial. So to illustrate, the duty to teach subject matter in accordance with disciplinary expertise requires teachers to teach, it seems to me, about climate change and fossil fuel consumption, partially, at least in their role as a science teacher. Okay. However, note that if the same teacher, like you said, essentially shifts roles to the civic educator, rather, they might be then be justified in teaching about the very same issue impartially. Right? It depends on their role. It depends on their posture as a professional. Similarly, if perspectives are voiced or entertained in class that could reasonably lead certain students to feel unwelcome or psychologically unsafe, then a teacher has an obligation to avoid or not tolerate those perspectives in class. Paradigmatic cases, of course, are homophobic or racist perspectives. The key thing to note here is that it's the teacher's professional obligations that generate both the duty of impartiality and justify making exceptions to the duty of impartiality, not the definitional characteristics of the issues themselves, and not whether the issue might or might not be disruptive of the school environment. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks, Bruce, for wrapping up in 5 minutes, just like I asked. Questions?
Yes, my question is for Mr. Journell, because I teach at an adult center, and there was recently like a polarized issue about inclusive bathrooms, right? And I wanted to know what was your take, because it was also, I felt that among my peers, like my colleagues and teachers, there was a prescriptive take on it. Then you couldn't, there was no nuance on whether or not you were going to discuss this with students if the subject, came on in class. And so personally, I felt a bit censored, because I was like, well, I don't have to agree 100% with you, but then I felt like there was really an aggressive, prescriptive way to. So how would you, I know it's not directly like in the classroom with the students, but it's still part of the life at school. And then it's still going to have an impact on how you're going to address the issue with your students. So what is your take on it? Because you don't want either to to start. I did not want, actually, I just took the position that you said at the beginning of your conference. You said, well, I chose the easy way out. I did not say anything, but that's not how situation changes. And what would be your take on that?
So, I think I got your question right. Are you asking about whether it was when you talk to students about it, or
I would not have addressed it the way I was prescripted
Gotcha.
to address it, but then I did not want to get in a, because I'm a new teacher also,
Mhm.
so and there was the anciency and all, many things playing in that situation.
Yeah.
So I did not want to kind of confront that person. Nobody did actually, but I did not agree on the take. It was very one take and one way to address this situation. So I would wonder how you would deal with that.
So it sounds like you're not talking about the issue specific, because I've actually written about that specific issue about inclusive bathrooms. Because back in North Carolina, we actually passed this statewide law called HB2, and so I actually wrote a article about going back to the criteria that I used, that I would teach that as a settled issue, because because it was a controversial identity issue, that there was, from an epistemic standpoint, there's no reason why we shouldn't have inclusive bathrooms, right? But I think your question is, if I'm hearing you right, how would you respond to like somebody saying prescriptive, right? So this goes back to one of the things that I'm trying to work on now. It's actually really hard, trying to build that gap between the practitioners and the people that are the administrators, because they often see things differently, and opening up those dialogues. Because it's funny, because I get asked to do professional development a lot of times, right? And I'm usually speaking to teachers, or I'm usually speaking to like curriculum facilitators, and usually I'm preaching to the choir, right? And I've always told them that, I really need to go talk to the administrators, right? So that they can understand that, when you're talking about an issue like this, there are multiple perspectives. So you shouldn't be giving a prescriptive type thing. Now, when you are a practitioner and you've been told a certain way to do certain things, it does put you in a tough spot, because it's like, especially you said you're a first year teacher. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So, that's tough. It's hard to, have that agency to come up and say, I disagree with the way you're telling me to do something like that. But I do think, and again, going back to the criteria, one of the things that I like about the criteria is that I've found that it gives teachers a way to start that dialogue with their administrators, to say, have you ever thought about it from this perspective? Right. Now, they might not change their minds at all, but I have found that, a lot of times teachers have a hard time starting that conversation with their administrators, because they think, oh, the administrators are just going to tell me I got to do this, this, or this. But a lot of times I found that administrators tend to be reasonable when you come in, you know, armed, for lack of a better word, armed with, a good understanding of why you want to do something the way you do it. You just have to be able to have that line of communication. And a lot of times we don't have that communication between teachers and administrators. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So first of all, thank you for the lecture, and I just want to ask a very short practice-based question. So based on what you and Bruce said during the lecture, so I think like my take on that, it's like how we discuss these like questions are sort of based on the context. Like either it's a perhaps like broader, or it's like in classroom context. Like I know it's like Bruce is talking about like professional obligations, but again, it's taking like the classroom as that zone. But that sort of makes me starting to like just having some confusion about the criteria you have provided, and of course also the examples, because you know, while you are like describing them, they are sort of like zoning out on usually like on the researchers and the broader society as a whole. But in actual practice, it could, and like for example, in classrooms, it could perhaps be different. You know, I that you for example, if you teach as you said, you know, if you're teaching and as a teacher in like a in a for example like red state, yeah, things could be could be different. So my question is, you know, how would you say in practice do educators define that zone based on, you know, what like when trying to applying those contexts, you know, what how do how do we adjust that zone? How do we adjust that range of that context? Like how large or small it is? Yeah, that is my question. Thank you.
Yeah, good question. I think it kind of goes back to what Cam was saying in his thing. I- At this, I agree that the local is key with this, right? Because you might be in a red state, but your where your school is in a blue area, right? Um, so I would say as local as possible would be how I would define the zone. I think if I'm hearing your question correctly, because at least in the United States, the we have gerrymandered, for the lack of a better word, school districts, right? So it's rare for to have a ton of ranges of opinions within your within your classes. Sometimes you do, but if your school is in a conservative like neighborhood, you're going to have a largely conservative students and vice versa, right? So I would say the local, right? Now that said, Bruce made a good point about you know the legal side. The legal side usually comes from the state or national level on down. So you do have to keep that in mind. But when you're thinking about the students that are in front of you, I tend to think more on the local aspect of it. Yeah. I'll use this one.
Thank you. And just one follow-up questions. What do you think would happen if, for example, there would be like like foreign interventions from, like, for example, from the boards or from the school districts? Like, how do we fare about that when when that sort of situation comes in? Because we definitely have to think about the students, because we are, again, as educators, responsible for them. But what but what about, but as teachers, we have other duties and obligations, and usually some of those sometimes we have to do things that we might not voluntarily want. So how would you say, if we like face up that kind of situations?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right? And that's, Mr. Hahn had to deal with something like that, the teacher that I was serving as an expert witness on. So to go a little bit deeper into that case, he got reprimanded by his principal, well, first by parents and then by principals. And then they told him that he needed to stop with, teaching these issues. And he felt strongly that because he was teaching a contemporary issues course, and this was in 2020 when there was a presidential election and we had the George Floyd murder and stuff. It's like, how do you teach a contemporary issues course without talking about these issues? And so he felt strongly about it, and he continued, but he also lost his job. So at some point, I wish I could give you a definitive answer with that. What I always tell my students is that you want to be able to sleep at night, right? And do what you think is right. And sometimes doing what you think is right does have consequences. But at the same time, you're a professional. If your boss says to do something, sometimes you have to do it. But at the same time, you also have to maintain, that relationship with your students and be authentic with them as well. So it's not an easy answer. I wish I could give you just an easy prescriptive answer on that, but yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more short question now.
Short question. So I have two questions. One's super short, but one's a little longer. I'll do the first one. The first one's super easy, I think. I was just wondering if you would agree with the label. Well, first of all, thank you for the framework of considering how to think about issues. I actually super enjoyed that. Do you think it would be fair to label that framework a framework of considering the potential danger of teaching an issue?
You could. I don't. Yeah, I don't know how well that would play, but yeah. I mean, there. I try to think about those criteria as a way instead of potential danger. I try to flip it to because the teachers are my pre-service teachers in particular. They already are aware of the dangers, right? I try to think of the criteria as a way to open up dialogue to get to the point where they can um, look at it as a positive thing rather than the danger, right? Because if you can have this open dialogue with your administrators or whatever, you can. There are teachers out there who are engaging in discussions of controversial issues and politics every single day, and they're doing it well and they're doing it great, and the students are benefit from it. I always tell people that when I was a K-12 social studies teacher, I didn't know all that terminology back then, but I taught in Roanoke, Virginia, and I tend to be fairly liberal on my political views, but I taught in Roanoke, Virginia, which is right in the middle of the Bible Belt in the U.S. And my students and I had a great relationship. I never had trouble with administrators because I had an open dialogue with the administrators. You know, rarely, if ever, had problems with parents. If anything, it was the liberal students who got irritated with me because I wouldn't let them off the hook just because we agreed with the same thing. And my conservative students, I mean, they loved that I would give them, space to talk about these things because, some of their other teachers wouldn't, and we would have a respectful discourse. And I think, as long as you can justify your pedagogy, which is why I think those criteria are useful. I think it lessens the danger and it gives more opportunity. At least that's
Well, I
the way
think your point of being thoughtful was super important.
Yeah.
That was helpful. Do I have time for my complicated question? It's very multilateral and it involves many of the speakers, so I don't know.
I think, guys, we have to
Okay.
probably end it there.
Darn, the complicated question.
Sorry, I mean, it's always nice. We can continue the discussion. We've got our small group discussions coming right up, folks. So let's have a round of applause for our speaker and respondent. Thanks a lot.
One thing before just